Well, hello, everybody. I wasn't sure I was going to make it tonight, but here we are. So, for tonight, we are going to start with the following document. Can everybody see that? Just type yes in the chat if you can see the document here. There's Hebrew followed by English, followed by Hebrew, followed by English. Anybody aware? Anybody there? Okay. You can see it. Okay, good. All right. So these are various verses from Genesis from the weekly Torah reading. As everybody knows, the weekly Torah reading is, it changes every week. There's a section that we read every week. This particular week, we read a section called Vayetze, which talks about after Jacob, Yaakov, had gotten the blessings from his father, Isaac, who was blind, as we know. He went in pretending to be his older brother. They were twins, but there was the older brother Esau. So he went in and took the blessings at his mother's behest. His mother told him this is what you have to do, so he did it. He got the blessings instead of his older brother Esau, and Esau wanted to kill him. And therefore, Rebecca, Rivka, that's Jacob's mother, Jacob and Esau's mother, went to her husband Isaac, Yitzchak, and said, our son should go and make a life for himself, go and find a wife elsewhere, not around here. I don't want him to marry one of the girls around here. Of course, the implication being that he shouldn't be around his brother who is seeking to do him in. That's the background to the story, and it says the actual section starts off with the words Vayetze Yaakov mi Be'er Sheva vayelech Harana. Jacob left the city of Be'er Sheva, which is in the southern part of Israel, and he was on his way to Haran. Haran was where his mother was from originally, and that's where he was going to go and look for a wife. Just as his father found a wife over there, he was going to find a wife over there. All right, so he goes on his way. He's on his way to Haran. And what happened? What happened was he passes a certain area, which is called Har HaMoriah, the Mount Moriah, or as it's explained in Kabbalah, the idea, the mountain on which teaching is found, on which inspiration is found, on which enlightenment is found, because that was where Isaac had almost been sacrificed by his father Abraham, by Abraham. It was on Har HaMoriah that the Akedah, the almost sacrifice of Isaac, took place. And that's where the place from where Isaac ascended to, Yitzchak ascended to Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, for 2 years. Right, his soul went up. He wasn't actually slaughtered on the altar. The angel came and stopped him, as we learned in last week's section. The angel came and stopped Abraham from doing this, even though he had, so to speak, ostensibly asked for this. And I don't want to go into the whole story now, but in any event, Jacob is on his way out of Israel. He passes Mount Moriah, Har HaMoriah, and he doesn't stop. And he moves on, right? He's on his way to Haran, and he passes Mount Moriah, doesn't even think of stopping. And that's where this first verse comes in. Vayifga b'makom vayalen sham. He encountered the place, or he happened upon the place, and spent the night there. Now, this word Vayifga it's an unusual word. It means two things. It can mean two things. It could mean that he prayed there, Vayivgah, he prayed at that place. Or it could mean that he happened upon that place unexpectedly. Because what had happened was after he passed by this area, so he stopped in his tracks and he said, well, this was a place that my father ascended to the Garden of Eden from. It was a place where Abraham showed his willingness to sacrifice everything for the sake of God. Should I not go back there? Should I at least visit the place and perhaps pray there, pray for success, and so on? So as he thought of going back there, he suddenly found himself at that place. He was brought there miraculously, or as our sages say, the place was brought to him. Rather than he went there, the place came to him. Now, without looking into this in great detail, we have to try and understand why it was that Jacob initially thought of just bypassing this place and not stopping there at all. After all, it's a well-known tradition that when you come to a place where a miracle occurred to you or to your forefathers, that is a place that you should stop at and say a blessing and say a prayer at such a place. And yet we see that Jacob had no intention of doing it, and we have to understand why that is. In any event, he did go back to the place, or the place came to him, and he was miraculously found himself in that place. As we translate, he encountered the place. He happened upon there unexpectedly, so to speak. Vayolen Sham, he slept there in the night. Kiva Hashemesh, because the sun suddenly set. Unexpectedly, the sun set earlier than he would have anticipated. In fact, the Zohar and various other Kabbalistic works, as well as other writings of the sages, say that the day was miraculously shortened, so he should fall asleep there, he should sleep there and stay there the night, which he did. And then he has this dream where he sees angels ascending up to heaven and descending on a ladder, and then the voice of God comes to him that he will protect him, and so on and so forth. We'll see some of these verses shortly. In any event, the sun had set, Vayikach mi avnei hamakoim, and he took some of the stones, or he took from the stones of that place, V'yasem merashotav, and he put them at his head, or under his head, Vayishkav, and he lay down b'makom hahu, at that place. So if you look into the grammar over here, you don't see it reflected much in the English. I've highlighted this word me'avne because it's going to be a very critical word. He took from the stones of that place. And then it says he placed it at his head. Vayasem, he placed it at his head. So initially there were many stones apparently, and they became one stone. And he lay down in that place and put his head on the stone. Others say he surrounded his head with stones, but the sun became one stone, whatever. This concept of stones here is, as we will see, a very important one, because the next verse also talks about what happened with the stone, and again it calls it a single stone. He took of the stones in the plural, and then later on it becomes one stone. We have to understand why the many stones became one stone, and we will look into that as well. Vayashkem, so this after he slept and he had this dream and so on and so forth, and God appeared to him and said he would protect him and so on. And then what happens? Vayashkem Yaakov baboker, Jacob gets up early in the morning, Vayikach sa'eben, and he takes this stone on which his head was resting, Asher Samer Rashotav, that he had put at his head, or literally underneath his head, I guess. Vayasem otam atzeva, and he sets it up as a monument. Vayitzok shemen al roshan, he anointed the stone with oil, right? He poured oil on top of it as an anointment, in other words, as a sanctification of the stone. And what was the purpose of sanctifying the stone? Because he says, he makes a promise, he makes an oath. Vaha even hazot, this stone, asher samti matzeva, which I have made as a monument, yeh beit Elokim, it will be a divine house, it will be a house to God. If he comes back safely, he says before this, if God will protect me on the road and give me what I need and so on and so forth, my basic needs, then it will become a house of God for me. Everything you will give me, God, I will take off a tenth and give it to you. In other words, I will dedicate it to charity, or I'll dedicate it to any cause which promulgates or makes famous the concept of godliness in the world. That's what he was saying. He's going to donate money to his 1/10 of his possessions. He's going to tithe his possessions and give that for spiritual causes. So one of the things another thing we have to understand, first of all, the first question, why Jacob decided not to go past, not to leave the main road and walk off to this place where his forefathers had been, which you would have expected him to do. And why does the stone become one stone when he takes several stones? And what is the whole concept of the stone? As we see, the stone becomes very important, becomes the basis of the temple that would be built later on Mount Moriah, which was the holy temple in Jerusalem. This would become later on the area of Jerusalem, and this would be the Temple Mount, right? The idea this hill would become the Temple Mount, where the Beit HaMikdash, where the temple would be built in the future. So we see that it's a very, very critical, a critically important stone. And that is in fact the place where the Holy of Holies was later established. Okay, so these are the questions that we have to approach and that we would like to understand and perhaps answer if we can. The idea, I would venture to say, is as follows. Why was it that Jacob decided not to go to the place where his forefathers had been? For a simple reason. He looked at the life of his father, his grandfather rather, Abraham, and Abraham did not follow in his father's footsteps. As we know, Abraham's father was an idol worshiper, was an idolater. And Abraham, even at a very young age, realized the foolishness of idolatry and smashed his father's idols and got himself into a lot of trouble with the ruler of that place, with Nimrod, who was the ruler. And Nimrod threw him in a furnace, which he survived, right? Miraculously survived. Okay, so we see that Abraham did not follow in the footsteps of his father, and quite rightly. But interestingly enough, Isaac did not follow in the footsteps of his father either. Abraham was a person that was extremely outgoing, and he would invite, the way he publicized godliness in the world, he would invite people into his tent. He had a tent that had doors in all four directions, so no one would think that they're not welcome in his tent because the tent would be closed to them. So he made an opening to his tent in all four directions, so that whatever direction people were coming through, they would see an open door and they would come in. And he would welcome them and he would greet them and he would serve them with food in the desert, food and water and delicacies and so on and so forth. And then when it came time for them to leave, he would say, before you go, thank the one who provided these things. So they would thank him and say, no, it's not me. Thank God who provided the wherewithal for me to offer you this meal. And they would thank God. If they didn't want to thank God, he would present them with a bill. So obviously everyone was very much willing to thank God for the food that he had provided. Okay. That was the way Abraham did things. Isaac, Yitzchak, was a very, very different type of person. He wasn't outgoing, gregarious, inviting people in, having big, what they call in Hasidic terminology, big Verbringen, right? He wasn't into Verbringens and having a lot of people around. He was a person that went out into the fields in isolation to pray and to meditate. He went out into the fields to meditate by himself. And he also, one of his other things that he did was he dug wells, right? He dug the wells to remove the dirt in order to get to down deep underneath the surface of things, get to the living water. He dug wells. So his idea was very different from Abraham. Abraham was one who went out, publicized godliness in the world. Isaac went within, deep into himself, meditation, prayer, looking for the well springs, the living water which bubbles up from underneath the surface when all the dirt and all the muck and all the things that are hiding the living water have been removed. Completely different approach. Kabbalistically, Abraham was the attribute of chesed, of kindness, of outgoing kindness. And Yitzchak, Isaac, was the opposite. He was the quality of gvura. Gvura, in this sense, doesn't only mean harshness, it means withdrawal. He withdrew from the world, he withdrew inside himself. That's the kind of person he was. He withdrew inside himself in order to elevate his soul up to a higher level. He was a very different type of personality. Isaac was the type of person who only approached godliness through or primarily approached godliness through the attribute of gevura. Completely different thing. So he did not follow, although in a general sense, of course, he followed the path of his father in the sense that he was a God-fearing, God-believing person. But nevertheless, he had a completely different approach. So Jacob, at this time, thought that the proper way to approach things was to find your own path, make your own path. And the very fact that his parents had now sent him out of the land of Israel to the land of Haran, the area called Haran, which is outside of the land of Israel, gave him to understand that he also had to beat his own path in life. He had to find his own way. And then once he had passed that place, and that's why he didn't go and pray at the place where his forefathers had been. That is not necessary. Because I have to beat a new path, there's no need for me to go back on that path, to go back to where they were, because I have to find a new path for myself. Just like my grandfather Abraham found a new path, and just like my father Isaac found a new path, I too have to make a new path in life. But then a while after he passed this place, he stopped for a while and he started thinking about it. Well, maybe I should go back. And then miraculously, the place came to him, or he found himself in that place where they were at Mount Moriah, Har Moriah. And he understood from this that therefore he has to do something that does not ignore what his father and grandfather did, but rather he has to somehow amalgamate that into his own path of life. So that is why when he came there, he took from the stones of the place. Let's just share the document again. He took from the stones of that place. He took from the varying approaches to things. A stone represents, as we have learned in Sefer Yetzirah, in the Book of Formation, it says two stones. Stones are compared to letters. Two stones build two houses, right? That's what it says in Sefer Yetzirah. 3 stones build 6 houses. In other words, the 2 stones in a combination can go Aleph Bet, Bet Aleph, A B or B A. That combination of 2 letters, the A B builds one type of house, B A builds another type of house. So the stones are called letters. The stones build. So he took from the stones, which are disparate stones of that place, in other words, the different paths that there are, and there are many disparate and different paths towards God, There was the path of Abraham, there was the path of Isaac, and he indeed did make his own path, but his own path was an amalgamated, incorporated those two paths of his grandfather and his father as well. So therefore, he took from the stones of the place, placing it. He made all of those different disparate things into one path, placing it in the singular at his head. And he lay down in that place. And therefore it says later on, he took that stone, in other words, that amalgamated path, where he incorporated what Abraham had achieved and what Isaac had achieved, and he incorporated it into his own approach to things. Therefore, Yaakov is called the attribute of Tiferet. Tiferet is the attribute which combines Chesed and Gevurah. I should have gotten up a chart over here, but it's not too late. Let's get up a chart of the Sfirot, and we will see what I mean. Nope, 1 second, I'm sorry. I'm just looking for the plain chart. Oh, here we are. Okay. Here we go. Okay, so the Sfirot representing Abraham was the Sfirah of Chesed. This one over here. This one over here, I'm sorry, Chesed. Isaac is represented by Gevurah. And Jacob is represented by the attribute of Tiferet. Tiferet is a combination of Chesed and Gevurah, although it is a new Sfirah. It's not just half this and half that. It's a new thing. When you combine two things together, like let's say you combine together eggs and cheese, you don't have eggs and cheese, you have an omelet, right? Okay, so it's a new thing, comprised of the two previous things, but it's a new entity. You don't call an omelet an egg and cheese loaf or something. You call it an omelet, right? You mix the two things together completely. So that's what he did. He mixed the two things together, which creates Tiferet, which is often translated as beauty, because beauty is a combination of two things. One plain color is not called beautiful on its own, right? It's only when there's a combination of different colors that it becomes, has this idea of beauty. So let's get back to the text. He made them into one stone. And that stone became a monument, and that monument would, eventually became the basis of the house of God. Now the Kabbalists explain that the word Even, let me just write it out over here. The word Even is a combination of the words Av and the word Ben, right? Av and Ben. Av means the father, Ben means the son. So when you combine these two together, right, and since you have two of the same letter, just is represented by one letter, so that spells the word Even. In other words, basically, the whole point of this stone that he made into one thing was the ability and the commitment to transmit what he had learned from his father and his grandfather, and to make that, to amalgamate that into himself in order to transmit it to his children. That's the greatness of Jacob. Jacob made a commitment. He made a commitment to his children at that point. He wasn't even married at this point in time, but he made a commitment that when he leaves the Holy Land and he goes to this place called Haran, which has very negative connotations. It means the place where the anger of God is, where the anger of God burns. Haran af shel makom. The anger of God burns there. Why? Because the people were very unprincipled and very rebellious against godly concepts. There were people who didn't have any morals. There were people who were, the place of Haran was full of thieves and brigands and robbers and murderers and idolaters and so on and so forth. And therefore was a place which, so to speak, angered God. Jacob knows that he's going there. And he thought initially that he's going to go there and forge a new path. Then he gets an idea, well, maybe that's not the best way to go about things. Maybe I can amalgamate what I have learned from my father and my grandfather and forge a new path out of their previous paths. Bring those things together and extend them further. So Jacob therefore becomes the bridge between the previous generations and his children, which are the next generation. This is why it says about Jacob that his bed was complete. Why was his bed complete? Which means that his children were all saintly. All of his children, he had 12 sons and a daughter, and all of them were saintly. Whereas with Abraham had a son named, besides Isaac, Yitzchak, he had a son named Ishmael, who was not exactly the most principled and moral and ethical fellow around. How much more so the other son of Isaac, who was Esau, was not only an unprincipled person, he was a murderer and an idolater and a rapist and various other things. And there's a whole list and litany of things that Esau represented. And unfortunately, he didn't just represent it, he represented it perfectly. He was the perfect example of what you don't want to be. Whereas Jacob's children were all perfect. Why? Because Jacob made a certain commitment. There's other reasons for it as well. That it was only things only become established in the third generation, essentially. But Jacob made this, Yaakov made this decision that he is going to transmit the tradition to his children, and he's going to make sure that they grow up understanding that there's a firm foundation on which the temple is going to be built. The future temple is going to be built on this concept of Av and Ben, on transmitting the teachings to your children. And that is, in fact, one of the commandments of the Torah. You have to teach these things to your children. You can't let your children grow up in a vacuum, and whichever way they go, it's going to turn out fine. They'll be okay. And you just leave them sort of to their own devices. We don't want to give our children complexes. We don't want to tell them what to do. We want them to find their own way. Well, everybody knows that if you bring up a pet, if you take a dog that was a puppy, a little puppy, and you don't ever discipline the puppy, and you don't ever instruct the puppy, and there's no yes, do this, and no, don't do that, that it's going to be a disaster. The puppy will grow up wild. It'll be a wild dog, and he'll make a mess of the entire place, and he won't be disciplined. Right? The same thing would happen with a horse. When in the days when they used horses for transport, the horse had to sort of be broken into the job. Similarly with our children, we have to pass on a certain tradition. We have to tell them what's right and what's wrong. We have to pass on the ideas that we understand and believe to be true and right and good to our children, and make sure that they are firmly entrenched. They're like a rock, firmly entrenched in the earth, in their understanding of what is right and what is wrong. If you understand right and wrong, then you can avoid evil and you can do good. But if one doesn't understand, or if one just leaves right and wrong up to personal proclivities, personal choices, that a person will say, well, since in certain parts of Africa, cannibalism is okay, so if you want to be a cannibal, go be a cannibal. If in other parts of the world, there's honor killings. So if you go ahead, it's up to you. No, there's a certain tradition, there's certain laws, there's a certain approach, and we have to take very, very seriously this idea of transmitting the values of the previous generations to the coming generations. That is what this whole concept of the Evan was all about. As we said before, this is the concept of Evan is an amalgamation of Av Uben, right? The father and the child become one thing when they have the same value structure. Now, you may ask, and you may think that that's not the right way to approach things. We have to let our children be free thinkers. We have to let them come to the truth by themselves. Children will come to the truth by themselves, but you have to give them the tools. You have to tell them how you see right and wrong, how you see good and evil. A child is not able to distinguish between right and wrong by himself or by herself. They need to be instructed in these things. If anyone ever saw, what was that? There was a book, and there was a movie made from it where these children get stranded on a desert island. What's it called now? I forget now. Anyway, the children get stranded on a desert island, and Lord of the Flies. That's it. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Wendy. Yeah, Lord of the Flies. I read it many, many, many years ago. So, in the story of Lord of the Flies is that these children get stranded on a desert island. If you think people are naturally good, just go watch that film and you'll see. They gang up against one particular boy, and there's no one wants to side with that boy because it's against the group, except one very principled young man who decided that he's gonna sort of protect this poor one or two of the guys of this whole group, and they were hounded by the main group. Interesting story, Lord of the Flies. But the basic the basic idea is that unless children are taught right and wrong, they're not going to get it by themselves. It's not something that comes up naturally. Naturally, a person is born with a lot of potential for evil. There's a lot of potential for good, but the evil will come out automatically, and the good has to be inculcated, has to be taught. And that's the lesson that Jacob took from this place when he fell asleep and he dreamed that in this place, this is where the ladder to heaven was, that the angels were ascending and descending on. He understood that his job was to connect his generation, the previous generations, to the coming generation. He had in his mind already when he went to Haran what it is that he had to do. He has to make a house for God. And the only way to do that was by transmitting his values, the values of his father and the values of his grandfather, to his children, which he did admirably, and all of them turned out to be very saintly children. And that's the way that civilization can proceed and improve constantly. Okay, there's some questions over here. Each path, Jew, Muslim, Christian, even Buddhists have a tradition of generational transmission of their teachings and affirming their belief. How do we all believe we're right? How do we avoid or settle conflict, even the political left and right in our country? Correct. Okay, that's a good question. But this is a question that is also, I'm not saying that you're doing it, but it's also a question which has given rise, this question has given rise to a movement, an intellectual movement called postmodernism. What's postmodernism? Postmodernism says like this: since there are all kinds of different cultures, and every culture believes itself to be right, so there's no right and there's no wrong. It's just a matter of whatever choice you want to make. You want to make a choice of this culture, that culture, etc., etc. That's up to you. There's no right and wrong, because since any interpretation is good, I can interpret things any way that I want, and therefore I can interpret things against the ostensible will of God. Now, you will ask me, well, how do we know what the will of God is? Okay, so this is going to be, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of points of contention over here, but I think everyone would agree that the Ten Commandments are the basic principle. Certainly, Judaism bases itself on the Ten Commandments and much more, but at least the Ten Commandments is the basis. I think Christianity also does. And I'm not sure where Islam is in terms of Ten Commandments, but I think that everyone would agree that it's a good basis for starting. And without the first commandment, which is "I am the Lord your God," without God in the picture, then moral values just become moral relativism. In other words, if it's done in one society, it can be done in any society, and there's no right, there's no wrong. It's just what you feel like doing, which can lead to a tremendous amount of conflict and strife, and ultimately to destruction. So all the world's major religions can agree upon one thing. I hope that that's true. Love your neighbor as yourself. Yeah, I hope it's true. And that, in fact, is what Hillel, the great sage Hillel, someone came to, he wanted to convert to Judaism. Now, this is not an advertisement for conversion. Conversion is a difficult process, and it's not something which Jews do not try and convert others to Judaism. Everyone has their religions that they're born into, they're just fine. We all have to live moral lives, and Judaism doesn't look for converts. But anyway, someone who came to the great sage Shammai, who was a contemporary of Hillel, great sage Shammai, and said, I would like to convert to Judaism, and tell me the basic principles of Judaism while I stand on one foot. In other words, tell it to me in a nutshell. I don't want all the details. I don't want all the... And Shammai just chased him away. He said, how can you put it into such a nutshell that I can give it to you while you're standing on one foot? Impossible. But the man was persistent, and he went to Hillel, who was a contemporary of Shammai, and he said to Hillel, again, teach me the entire Torah while I stand on one foot. And he said to him, what is hateful to you, do not do to another. In other words, love your neighbor as yourself, but in the negative sense, what is hateful to you, do not do unto others. Do not do to others. Now, this was, we're talking about here, this was about 2 centuries before the Christian era began. So we're talking about a commandment that is actually mentioned in the Torah: love your neighbor as yourself. Right? Love your neighbor as yourself. It's a commandment in the Torah itself. But he put it in the negative sense. Do not, if you can't love your neighbor as yourself, at least don't do any harm. Like like doctors are told, they have to take an oath. At least don't do any harm, right? So that is a basic principle of love your neighbor as yourself, or at least what would be distasteful, harmful, odious, disliked by you, make sure not to do to somebody else. That's the basic bare minimum. And then one can come to love of one's fellow. In any event, that is the basic idea of the greatness of Jacob, of his willingness and his decision to transmit what the previous generations had learned to his children, to make himself a bridge for the next generation. And that is why all of his children turned out to be very upright and saintly people. Okay, any further questions?